Roland Emmerich is a good filmmaker, bordering on great. I feel like I should get that out of the way right up front. He's one of our best action filmmakers, that much should be beyond question in my opinion. In particular, he's one of the best big-scale disaster technicians probably ever in the grand scheme of things. Now this is where I'm supposed to say that where he's lacking is telling stories or creating compelling drama, but honestly when he's on, he's actually pretty good at that too, at least in terms of the melodramatic moviness that his work tends to deliberately aim for. Now, where Emmerich screws up is when he doesn't give a shit. Some directors can turn out good work even when they're not deeply invested in the material. I mean, it's pretty damn clear Guillermo del Toro wasn't as profoundly attached to Blade 2 or Pacific Rim as he was to his own passion projects. And look how good those movies turned out. But Emmerich is not that kind of guy. When he's into something or thinks he has something to say, you get legit classics like Stargate or the original Independence Day, fun rides like 2012 or The Day After Tomorrow or White House Down, and even joyfully unhinged gonzo nonsense like Anonymous or 10,000 BC. Hell, even Stonewall was a fascinating, passionate, committed version of absolutely terrible. But when Emmerich doesn't care, when he's just going through the motions, he can't fake it. His paycheck work is just awful, and you can always feel the distracted lack of giving a shit bleeding through the celluloid. Independence Day: Resurgence is Emmerich's worst film by far since the 1998 version of Godzilla, and just as the fact that he had no real interest in the Godzilla franchise came through loud and clear in that disaster, it is painfully clear that when it comes to Independence Day: Resurgence, Emmerich was punching a time card to solidify box office clout he just mortgaged a shitload of to make his passion project, and did not care one fucking bit about the sequel to Independence Day. And the result is the emptiest, most passionless big-scale blockbuster since, fuck, I don't even know, Ninja Turtles, Green Lantern maybe? But the thing is, how could anyone not phone in a sequel to Independence Day? Look, I'm on record as saying that the original Independence Day is a stone-cold classic, a legitimately great example of its take on the genre, and a film that actually lands, connects, and makes an impact in spite of itself. But it's also one of those of-the-moment, one-time use films where things that make it work are the things that make a sequel not only an unnecessary idea, but an actively terrible idea. See, the closest thing to genius about the production of what we, for some reason, decided to call ID4 was that it found a way to laser-focus the narrative of a fucking huge-scale sci-fi movie down to the human element by consciously downplaying or outright removing all the specifics about the sci-fi element. Basically, by reducing the bad guys to just the aliens in the spaceships in the most aesthetically universal terms possible, they figured out how to present an alien invasion movie in the format of a natural disaster movie, which is an incredible, brilliant, can't believe no one else thought of this before move once. One time for one movie, and that was it. Because the minute you decide to make a sequel in the same basic style and genre, i.e. more fucking aliens, more fucking spaceships, the same kind of action stuff, but fucking bigger, it requires you to create the kind of specifics in terms of bad guy motivation and lore and mythology that the first one deliberately and beneficially left out. So not only are you going to make a lesser sequel now, because instead of the lean, surprisingly character-centric sweep of the original, now you're getting bogged down in tedious expository bullshit, it's all reverse-engineered tedious expository bullshit, so it's not going to be any fucking good. What Resurgence tries to do is split the difference by trying to keep what new mythos it needs to add as lean and generic as possible still, and it predictably ends up smack dab right the fuck at the intersection of too much and not enough. So now it's 2016, but an alternate 2016 where we rebuilt the world with generically futuristic hybrid alien technology, but it doesn't really help us because it turns out there's a ginormous alien queen with an even bigger than before spaceship that shows up to fuck our shit up again, and the only hope is to establish contact with and protect what turns out to be a liaison from a good race of aliens that want to help us, presumably in part 3, and it's as lame and boring as it sounds, folks. Actually, it's even worse. See, there's the germ of an interesting idea in that most of the new characters are college-age kids who are either barely old enough to remember the original war in 1996 or too young to only remember the aftermath, and hey, doesn't that just sound like a ripe, easily exploitable metaphor for a real-world generation of the same age who've also grown up in a world of endless, uncertain military buildup in the wake of a similar world-altering tragedy? But the young characters, apart from Chinese model actress Angelababy, who turns out to be super charismatic, are completely boring, and even if they weren't, the movie is much more interested in dragging back whichever stars from the original didn't have anything else going on in a desperate bid for some of Jurassic World's millennial nostalgia dollars, so the whole human side is kind of a wash too. What's almost more depressing is that there's evidence that this didn't have to be a complete fucking waste of time. In the sole interesting new plot development of the entire story, we learn that during the original film, one of the saucers actually did land in Central Africa and deployed ground troops, and that a consortium of military, local militias, and armed citizens fought and defeated these aliens in a decade-long hand-to-hand ground war. Now that sounds like a fucking awesome movie. That's the sequel to Independence Day I would want to see. But it wouldn't have had saucers and space battles or much room for the original cast, so it would have been more like the old Planet of the Apes movies where every sequel was a totally new cast and a totally different genre. I'd have been fine with that, but yeah, that's not the way we do things anymore, apparently. Most damningly of all, the whole thing plays off cheap and lifeless. It clocks in at 100 minutes, but feels even shorter, largely because the whole thing has clearly been hacked to the bone, because they realized it wasn't working and figured they might as well at least make it able to play more showtimes and make some of its money back, which ends up meaning that nothing is allowed to have any real weight or narrative meaning. Characters live, they die, they make big life decisions, but there's no time for it to hang around and slow down like in the original movie, because they're in a hurry to get to the next fucking plot point that you're not gonna care about. And you know, whereas the first film felt lovingly handcrafted in its own overstuffed big budget way, since it was basically Emmerich and Dee Devlin and Centropolis and their whole crowd pouring a ton of effort into saying, hey, we're the new big dogs on the blockbuster scene, this is what the fuck we can do, this one just feels cheap and green screeny. All of Resurgence feels perfunctory and half-assed with old-looking CGI, obvious blue screen work. I mean, the first movie redefined what summer movie spectacle could and should look like, so it almost feels like a sick joke that its own 20 years later sequel can't even stand up to the low end of the competition this very year. I mean, the special effects maybe look about as good as an above-average Sci-Fi Channel TV series, like think Battlestar Galactica from like 10 years ago. Look, bottom line, this shit was probably never gonna be any good, but the fact that they didn't even try almost feels perfectly insulting. Skip it.